Hello, my name is Evie and this is a video just explaining briefly what happened to me back in 2015 when I was diagnosed with Anti NMDA Receptor Encephalitis. There's 6,000 cases each year in the UK alone. NMDA receptor is the antibody that is found in the blood, and why it's produced is unknown. When this antibody is to be found within the blood, it can cause confusion, altered personality or behaviour, psychosis, movement disorders, seizures, hallucinations, memory loss and sleep disturbances. And I experienced every one of those symptoms. So I am wanting to support those who have lived or are currently living through encephalitis, and I'd love to raise awareness of this disease too. I would like to just give a brief explanation of what happened pre-diagnosis, my symptoms, my hospital stays, treatments, and then recovery as well. My hope is to then make more specific videos about each of those points, if that would be helpful to others. So I will start by just explaining a little bit about me before I was diagnosed. So I was 19, as I said, it was 2015. I was living with my then partner, and I worked for a green energy company full time, and I had lots of lovely friends there. I would go out most weekends. I was just your average healthy 19-year-old woman, until I began experiencing flu symptoms. So everything you'd expect from the flu, cold, aches. I had a really bad pounding headache, and I remember thinking I just can't go into work, but feeling as though I needed to. So I went in, and I felt so very tired that I in my lunch break fell asleep under my desk. So that was the beginnings of knowing that something was not quite right. The flu symptoms were getting worse, and I feel as though I have vague memory of kind of paranoia perhaps setting in. I started to develop perhaps the worry that I was being watched in places that we would be private. So for example, my own home, around my flat, just feeling really tired and forgetting things a lot as well. I was becoming more and more forgetful. Actually, I was just struggling and not feeling myself is the vague kind of memory I have of that, is just something not being quite right. But because I had those flu-like symptoms, I obviously associated it with it being due to just being really run down. One night, it was the weekend, my partner had been out all day, I was not feeling well at all, and when he returned in the evening, he said that he was going out for the night, and this is when real paranoia set in, and I panicked and said, well, let me come with you, you know, just let me get ready and I'll be there with you. And he was saying, you're not well, Evie, you can't come. And that just started a lot of fear within me, and I started panicking that perhaps he would go out and be unfaithful. So when I'm saying about these kind of paranoid thoughts, those were not typical for me, and my partner was just he said, look, I'm going out, and I was at this point begging him, saying, please let me come with you, or just don't go, and he left. At this point, my mum had what she explained as being some sort of mother's intuition that I wasn't right. So that evening, my mum then rang me, and she said, you don't sound very well, let me and your dad come and pick you up, and you can stay the night at our house back at home, which was around 20 minutes away. So I agreed to that. I went home, and I'm really grateful for my mother's intuition, because we were yet to know that that was going to be the night of my first seizure. So I will explain my first seizure in a bit more detail, so anyone who has been through this may be able to kind of relate to certain points. But I was, as I say, fluey. Once I got home, I began to feel a little bit sick. So I had said to my sister, I'm really not feeling well. I'm going to go to the toilet. My dad needed to drop my mum at work, so he had gone to do that. And in that time, I kept complaining of being, I was about to be sick, but was not, and went back into the living room and was watching television. And whilst my dad was gone, my sister was noting that my behaviour was not quite right. So I was just kind of being very quiet, and she could see I was unwell. Dad had come back, and Ruby was having a conversation with Dad, saying that she's really not well, Dad, you know. And I was looking at the TV and started to ask my sister who Keith Lemon was and why he was famous. This made her feel alarmed, because obviously I knew who that was. He's a well-known celebrity, and alarm bells started to ring for them both. It seemed as though I was going in and out of consciousness. So at this point, my dad rang for the ambulance. My sister then says I begin frothing from the mouth. So this is obviously where my seizure is beginning. I then wet myself, and I'm kind of slumped as my dad is talking to the ambulance. I'm able to actually talk, and I'm just kind of going in and out of responsiveness. My sister notices that I'm doing something with my mouth, so is worried about me choking on my tongue at this point, and tries to get my tongue out of my mouth, and I bite her finger, and I also bite my tongue very badly. In the time that we're waiting for the ambulance, a doctor comes first of all, and he immediately asks my dad what drugs I've taken, to which my dad says that I haven't taken any. From what I'm told, that specific doctor was being a little bit relaxed in that situation, and couldn't see really just how badly things were going. So I was given oxygen, but then when the oxygen was taken off, my lips were blue. I was continuing to foam at the mouth, and I was going in and out of absent seizures. To which point then the ambulance finally arrives. My mum has then been called back from work. The paramedic comes in and immediately sees the state I'm in, and puts me over his shoulder, brings me into the ambulance, at which point my heart has stopped. So my mum's told to get in the ambulance with me, and they shock me with the defibrillator. And I make my way to hospital, and that is when they decide that I need to be put into an induced coma. I would spend the next 48 hours in that coma whilst they're trying to stop my body from continuously seizuring. Obviously, it's incredibly dangerous when your brain is in that state. So 48 hours in the induced coma. I have very little recollection of this, of course, but my first memory of waking up is a severe pain in my mouth, which is obviously where I had bitten my tongue during the seizure, first seizure, and looking down at and thinking I'm in a hospital bed, and realising I've got a catheter in, and sorry, just being a little bit overwhelmed by all of that, and not really making sense of anything just yet. I remember kind of being sick upon waking and apologising to my sister who was there at the time because she had a phobia of sickness. But really the great news is I had stopped seizuring, and I was then to spend another week in hospital before they felt I could go home, and I was given anti-seizure medication. At this point, they are thinking that it could be meningitis or Guillain-Barré syndrome. They're not sure on a diagnosis at this point, but I am deemed well enough to go home. So I'm just given strict instructions not to be left alone and to rest. So I would then go on to spend another 2 weeks at home. That would be with my partner. So my parents would come and visit me every day, and my dad would say that it was clear that I wasn't able to take care of myself like I used to. So I have memory of really struggling to just do the usual things, personal hygiene, making food, leaving the house. At one point I left the house to go to the supermarket, and essentially I just remember everyone walking around and like their response to me being that of concern. I remember just going around the aisles and it feeling like I was in a dream. It was like I had no idea what I was doing, whereas obviously a few weeks prior I visited this regularly. I knew where everything was. I somehow made it home, and my neighbour had to help me in because I had locked myself out. Everything was becoming confusing. Just day-to-day stuff was no longer easy. I do remember as well my partner's family member coming to visit me and just feeling this sense of dread because it was so hard to hold a conversation, and feeling like some embarrassment around that. There are also hallucinations that were beginning to start at this point. So I remember there was a war being shown on the television, and I hid behind my sofa in complete fear and terror that I was part of that. And I would go on to have lots of different hallucinations. But the one that then sent me back into hospital was a night where both me and my partner were in bed, and he had work the following day. And I could not get out of my head that I believed my mum had died. And I was insistent on going to see her, and I was begging him and saying I must go and see her. I truly believed she had gone, and this was causing me a great amount of stress, as you can imagine, and I was hysteric at this point. To which point my partner says, I'm going to call the ambulance, and I beg him not to. And I remember being on my knees and just pulling at his legs and just begging him, please, please don't call the ambulance. Eventually he called his parents to come and collect me. This was late at night by this point, and they then took me to my parents' home, where I would just spend the rest of the early hours until the morning with them. I was unable to sleep. Insomnia is a huge part of encephalitis for most people, and it especially was for me. So my parents were taking it in turns, trying to get me to sleep next to them, and I wasn't having it, and I was just displaying really strange behaviour, which must have been very concerning to them. I was hallucinating again at this point, so I remember specifically thinking that I was pregnant with my sister. So I was pointing to my tummy and saying like, I'm pregnant with Ruby. And then as the sun began to rise, my sister was then awake, and she was saying that I was being quite childlike with her and giggling and messing about. And then I do remember looking in the bedroom mirror and seeing Ruby literally staring back at me. It was like I had morphed into my sister, which of course was terrifying. And I have found personally the hallucinations that come as part of this disease to be harrowing, and that they do haunt me to this day. Morning had come and my parents obviously could see that I needed to go to hospital, so first thing that's what they did, and I was readmitted. The junior doctor had asked me, as I had been readmitted, what my name was, and I had replied something along the lines of, I'm a higher being and I have been sent here from God. Not a usual response, and was clear to see that obviously things were not right. So I would then go on to have lots of different scans to try and determine what was going on. I was obviously still seizuring every day. The scans that I had were MRIs, but I was unable to stay still. By the time I had gone into hospital for this second time, I was becoming very agitated and my mood was extremely aggressive. So therefore MRIs were not able to be taken because I wouldn't stay still. My dad said I would kind of sit bolt upright as I was going into the tunnel and then just say things like, am I dead? EEGs. I had a CT, we had lots of different lumbar punctures, which of course again is really hard for someone to do when you as the patient are extremely agitated and have no idea really what's going on. Eventually an antibody was found in my blood, so that was the Anti NMDA receptor. So that was what then allowed my neurologist to give me the diagnosis of that form of encephalitis. So what was happening was that specific antibody was telling my immune system to attack my brain, which is where then you get the term brain on fire from. So as I say, in terms of my mood, I was extremely aggressive. I was chopping and changing really. I could be really emotional, and then there would be moments of kind of seemingly me being back to a bit more of myself. I was displaying the kind of movement disorders of just for hours upon end doing these strange movements with my limbs. And eventually I was put into a room on my own and was put under 24-hour watch basically, because there was an incident where I was looking out of the hospital window and I was looking at the birds, and I genuinely believed that I could fly. So I tried to get out of this window, at which point obviously my dad tries to hold me back. And he said that he was shocked by the power of me, you know, and the will. And I looked back at him and I actually specifically remember doing this and looking him in the eye and telling him to F off, and seeing his eyes brim with tears. It was an extremely hard time for everyone involved, and that's why I always acknowledge the difficulty that friends and family and loved ones go through when this diagnosis is given as well. There would be a lot of times where I wouldn't recognise friends and family members, which was hard and scary when you have people who love you dearly and actually you know them extremely well, and yet you can't recall who they are. I was continuing to have hallucinations. There were also moments where I was in great spirits and I was dancing and singing on the ward, and really, as you can tell, there was no control over my emotions, and I was there for 9.5 weeks in total. Essentially, I was on 30 tablets a day, just over that, and the thing that really helped me gain more clarity and allowed me to get a lot better than I was the immunoglobulin. I always struggle to say that. It's also known as Evie treatment. Essentially what that is lots of different antibodies that are put through the vein, and I had several rounds of that, which then allowed me to return to a much better state than I was in. There was a point where I was clearly getting very frustrated with being in hospital for quite as long as I was, and my parents would come and visit me, and every single day I had packed my bags and they would come in and I would say, I'm ready to come home now, you know, I can come home, and they would have to, of course, keep delivering the news of, I'm sorry, Evie, but you can't. It's not time. They did allow me to visit home for a day, so I went back with my parents, and I remember just feeling very weak, still not having a complete understanding of what was happening, and I had a bath, which was very nice after such a long period in hospital, and that was one of the first times I'd looked at my reflection. This was something I had struggled to do in the hospital because of the hallucinations and things, and I noticed that I had been putting weight on from the medication. When you're on steroids, they can call it the moon face that appears, and I do remember looking and thinking, I don't recognise that person, which is a really hard thing when you're also not kind of identifying with who you are inside, to then not see you as you know yourself reflected back at you, was a real struggle for me, and I'm sure for many other people too. So I then returned to hospital after that day, which was hard, and then went to see occupational therapists, and I was kind of I remember trying to give off the impression of like, okay, I'm sensing this is almost a test, is how I viewed it at the time, and I need to show that I'm better and I can manage. And I told them that one of my favourite meals was beans on toast. We were then trying to make that, and I remember not knowing how to use the toaster, not knowing how to open the tin of beans, and just feeling a little bit kind of downtrodden at my own belief that things were better, and in of course so many ways they were at that point, but they weren't well enough for me to kind of do something as simple as making beans on toast. So during my hospital stay, the second time round, my relationship did break down. So when it came to the time of discharge, I then went home with my parents, which was absolutely the best decision, and was difficult, but I was extremely grateful to have their support. I remember my parents saying them being shocked at just the amount of tablets that I was having to take, and kind of, from their point of view, having to become carers, which of course they were caring for me this entire time, but now I was in their responsibility, full responsibility, and that must have been tough. So I came home, and I remember feeling like I had taken 10 million steps back, because I was back sharing a room with my sister again. And obviously I had this life, you know, a few months beforehand where I was completely independent. I was living with a partner who I loved. I had friends around me. Life was good, and And whilst I was incredibly grateful for being alive and everything being okay, and to be surrounded by the love of my family, it was just hard, as you can imagine. It just felt as though nothing was as it should be, and it really, really felt as though nothing ever would be the same again. With regards to kind of how I was when I was back home, I was sleeping a lot, I was fatigued, I would struggle to sleep at night, so I remember would most days fall asleep at around 5 a.m. in the morning, and then wake up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2, 3 in the afternoon. So there was a real sense of kind of, it was almost like life had stopped. And if I'm brutally honest, I didn't see much joy in living at that point. So I was obviously being supported by my family. I remember going to see my old workplace with my mum and kind of being on her arm, walking in and seeing an old work colleague, and my mum sort of said hello, and she would have to talk on behalf of me essentially. And I remember seeing my old work colleague's eyes brim up with tears at just seeing, I guess, how kind of, not incapable, but how much weaker I was, and I was very much reliant on my mum to speak because I was struggling to hold a conversation. Things like, then I remember going and trying to sort my phone contract out, and obviously having no idea what my phone number was, and feeling kind of ashamed and embarrassed by that. And as time was going on, I was trying to kind of at least go outside and do things. So there was a baby shower that a family member was having, and I went along with Ruby, and my very own cousin didn't actually realise it was me because my appearance had changed so much due to the medication. And I remember that being really hurtful when I had found that out, you know, because a huge part of encephalitis survivors' lives is kind of struggling with this it's almost like a dual personality, because you're thinking back to the person that you were pre-diagnosis and trying to somehow get that to coexist with the person you are now, which is incredibly hard, and you just don't know how those two would ever merge, which is why you see them as two separate people, which didn't help me at all in my recovery. But my partner, for example, would say things like, I just want the old Evie back. Those words can be really hurtful and play on your mind for a long time. Because of my appearance, my also struggle with my identity, disassociation was a really big thing. This overall feeling of like nothing is real, I'm in a dream, when will anything feel the same? Mood swings, incredible anger that I had never felt pre-diagnosis. I began to feel extremely depressed. So I went to the GP about this, and at that point, when I had said that I had had encephalitis, he had to Google what encephalitis was. So just another reason why I'm so passionate to spread awareness of this. This was obviously a 7 years ago now, but not enough people know to this day what encephalitis is, even health professionals. So eventually I was then put across to a mental health nurse who gave me antidepressants, which weren't particularly helpful for me because I was already feeling detached from everything, and I kind of felt as though those antidepressants were amplifying that. I was then put into a low mood group, and I remember kind of listening to everyone's trials and tribulations, and of course feeling empathetic, and also feeling I need some very specific help, because no one understood. I was really pleased when my neurologist had then put me in touch with the neuropsychiatrists and neuropsychologists. I was then, I think, 3 years post diagnosis, and that was one of the most helpful things I had done. I had neuropsychological testing, which found that my memory had been impaired, my executive functioning was below average, my language was impacted, my attention and speed of information processing was also impaired due to encephalitis. So now that I am a fair few years down the line from my diagnosis, I count myself to be extremely lucky, and that's the reason that I'm recording this video today, is because there are so many out there that go undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and it needs to stop. I want to spread awareness. I want to be able to help those who have lived through a similar journey to my own, and really give hope to those who are in the midst of it now. Anyone who has lived through this, or is supporting someone who is living through it, you really are a warrior. And it makes me emotional, because upon reflecting of when times were really a lot harder than they are now, it just made me feel so grateful for me to be in the stage I am. But when I read through a journal that I kept during my time in hospital, it's really good to acknowledge just how tough those times are, because it makes you appreciate those little wins and the moments that that follow, such as returning to work. You know, I've been working for some time now, and I've got a little girl. I'm in a loving marriage, and actually there's so many points in that journal that I've written that I see that as completely incomprehensible. So it's hard to lose faith and think that nothing's ever going to return to normality, or that you might not ever feel happy again. But I really want people to take away from this video, if anything, that there is always hope. And if I can be of any help to anyone, then please reach out. Thank you very much for listening. I will note that the Encephalitis Society is a charitable organisation that is fantastic. They have wonderful information, wonderful support, and I'm very grateful to them. Thank you very much.